This is like a true story. It happened to a friend of mine at school. Her name is Lizzie, and she's like the most popular girl in the 9th grade. And she's like one of my best friends, even though I don't hang around her all that much because I'm way too busy. Lizzie and some of her other friends spend most of their time kind of standing around giggling and talking about boys and all the parties they go to and the cool clothes they wear. But Lizzie can't talk to them when she gets home because she has no phone of her own. Her parents said if she wanted her own phone, she was going to have to work to pay for it. Ugh. So, anyways, one day I hear that Lizzie has to babysit. Whatever. And the kid she has to take care of is my next door neighbor, the little monster, Jeffrey. I would have had the job, except I'm way too busy. So, okay, the night comes and Lizzie goes over to their house. She rings the doorbell and Jeffrey's dad answers the door. All of a sudden, this big dog comes running up to Lizzie and starts slobbering all over her new babysitting outfit. Jeffrey's dad is apologizing and saying he hopes Lizzie doesn't mind dogs. Oh, no, says Lizzie. I love animals, especially dogs. And don't worry, I don't mind if Mookie drools all over me. It's just saliva. It'll wash out. Boy, she must really want that phone. So then Jeffrey's mom tells Lizzie that little Jeffrey is asleep upstairs. And they leave. As soon as the door closes, bam, Lizzie is on the phone with her best friend, Marcia, and they're gossiping and exchanging hairdo hints. So here's Lizzie talking on the phone to Marcia, while every 5 seconds, Mookie the dog jumps up and slobbers all over her. Marcia gets bored with all the phone talk, so Lizzie turns on an old movie, a really sad one, and she's bawling her eyes out while Mookie, El Doggo Slobberino, is running in and out of the doggy door. Suddenly, Lizzie looks over and sees Mookie standing in a corner shaking a stuffed animal. He's really going at it, in the corner, next to an empty rabbit cage. Funny, she never noticed that empty rabbit cage! It's not a stuffed animal in Mookie's mouth, but a real live rabbit! Okay, a dead rabbit. Lizzie is really upset. This is awful! But Lizzie doesn't panic. She has an idea. Give me the rabbit, Mookie. But he's still shaking the bunny, saliva, and rabbit fur going everywhere. Lizzie takes a box of dog biscuits and empties it on the floor in front of Mookie, who drops the rabbit and starts gobbling. Lizzie can't let anyone know she let that stupid dog eat their rabbit. It was probably little Jeffy's Easter bunny. So she grabs the dead thing. Ugh, disgusting. And washes it up really good. A little hairdryer action, a once-over with a teasing comb, and the bunny looks almost new. Well, except for the one missing foot. Oh well, I guess that rabbit's foot wasn't so lucky. Lizzie puts the rabbit back in the cage like nothing ever happened, and she starts rehearsing what she's going to say. I was just sitting there on the couch reading a book when I heard the bunny keel over. Plop! Poor little creature died peacefully in its sleep. Just then, Jeffrey's mom and dad walk in. How did everything go tonight, Lizzie? They ask. Oh, good, except for one little thing, says Lizzie. And just then... Turns out Fluffy, that's the rabbit's name, died the week before and they buried it in their backyard. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Oh, Lizzie? She got her phone. Made the money working in a pet store. Grooming animals.
Now, this is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, a Peterson in Deutronium Sales. He happened to take a few days off with his family to one of those new tourist areas on Rigel 6. Give me a week baking on Mars. That's my idea of a vacation. This Rigel 6 place is so new, it's barely on the interplanetary map. So the Petersons, their 2 kids, Junior and Melody, and their mutt, Fifi, which they take everywhere, caught a charter to Rigel 6. Nobody knew all that much about the Rigelians. From what I heard, they weren't like other extraterrestrials. They had a single compound eye and oversized skulls, but their cuisine was getting known all over the galaxy. Peterson takes his rental pod, piles his brood inside, and heads out for Chez Rigels. Well, when they get to the door, the maitre d' tells them they're more than welcome, but that old Fifi just isn't allowed into the restaurant. So, it seems poor Peterson and his clan are going to have to leave without eating. Now, just as they're walking out, the maitre d' runs after them. It seems he'd felt badly for his guests, and he offered to let them have dinner at the restaurant. Peterson was mighty grateful, because the kids were starting to get cranky, and he really didn't want to drive around a strange planet looking for a restaurant at this time of night. But what about old Fifi? Well, says the maitre d', because you've come so far and you did have a reservation, I'll have some of the kitchen staff look after him while you eat. Well, the kids weren't so sure, but Peterson was starving. So he said, fine by me, and handed the leash over to the maitre d', who led Fifi back to the kitchen. Now, the Peterson clan pored over this huge menu, but the waiter insisted they try the specialty of the house. Now, the kids would have liked a Rigel burger, but Mrs. Peterson said, what the heck, when on Rigel, do what the Rigelians do. Now, Peterson was a bit suspicious and wanted to know what was in it. A secret, said the waiter, but he promised it would be fresh, very, very fresh. After complimentary hors d'oeuvres, the waiter wheeled in a large covered tureen and whisked off the lid, revealing a bubbling blue stew. Even though it looked pretty odd, everybody had to admit it smelled very tasty. And Mrs. Peterson was dying to know what was in it. Our chef's secret ingredient, was all the waiter said, and with that he ladled out a bowlful to each Peterson. The blue stuff bubbled away in their bowls, with chunks of something occasionally rising to the surface. And finally, Peterson dipped his spoon into the stew and took a tentative taste. Then another, and then he dove into it. And the others decided to give it a try. They snorkeled and guzzled, and it wasn't long before they were all clamoring for more. Mr. Peterson dipped the ladle into the tureen and began to serve another bowl to Junior. This time, there was a strange clunk as the stew hit the bowl. Junior dipped his spoon into the bowl and fished out a long blue strip of meat. He started to gnaw on it, but it was as tough as leather, and it wasn't blue anymore. It was red. Red leather, just like Fifi's collar. And it had a name tag on it. Fifi! How did that get into the stew? The Petersons looked at the collar hanging out of Junior's mouth. They all gagged, ran to the door, and sped away into the night. In the kitchen, Nigel and the maitre d' shook their heads. A waiter came rushing in, asking for the house specialty. Sorry, said the chef, no more secret ingredient left. Then he saw a paw sticking out from under the table. He pulled it, and there was Fifi. I don't suppose you have any more of that red leather, said the chef. Fifi just looked up and gave the chef a big, slobbery lick on his one eyebrow. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Peterson in sales. And now, when his family vacations, they take their own food and leave the dog at home.
Well, this is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. His name was Bud, and he was one of those big game hunters, you know? Some people think that sort of thing's cruel, but I tell you, Bud had stared the biggest polar bear down, face to face. He'd wrestle alligators just for fun. Why, he'd wander into a den of lions and not even flinch. But when it came to the smallest little spider, he'd turn into a quivering mold of jelly. Now, Bud was on safari in Africa, in the thickest jungle. He'd been trailing a tiger all day with nothing but a Bowie knife when he set up camp for the night. He was just drifting off, lying right on the African dirt, when the ugliest, hairiest little beetle kind of bug crawled right up the side of his head and gnawed its way into his left ear. Bud went balmy. He was running all over the camp, jamming his finger into his ear, trying to get the bug out. Bud could feel the earwig pincing away at his eardrum. By the time they got him to the clinic in the nearby village, Bud's eyes were spinning around in his head. The doctor took one look in his ear and shook his head. There was nothing he could do. The bug had got in too far. Any attempt to extract it could lead to permanent brain damage. Bud might just have to live with it scurrying around in there for the rest of his life, unless there was this old witch doctor at the edge of the jungle. Bud's hunter friends dragged him to a little hut down the end of a dark dirt road. The witch doctor was standing in the door of his weird old shack. He was ready to go to work. and he looked like he was going to enjoy it. He started by getting Bud's buddies to tie him down on this bamboo bed. They bound his arms and legs and strapped his head still, one ear facing up, while the witch doctor mashed up a bunch of bug lava he'd poured out of a rusty old tin can. Bud cringed as the witch doctor added little bits of dead moth wings and ground caterpillars. The old man started spooning the stuff right into his ear. Bud could feel the mashed stuff oozing down in there, all cold and slimy, filling every nook and cranny right up to his brain. The witch doctor said the smell of the dead insects would flush the earwig out of there, but it didn't work. The witch doctor was about ready to give up. Maybe the bug ought to just stay inside, but Bud wouldn't hear of it. He didn't care what the old man had to try next. He'd go with it. So the witch doctor started searching around the dirt floor of his hut until he found what he was looking for. The biggest, meanest male African earwig anyone had ever seen. The witch doctor tied this long piece of hair round the earwig's head and then carried him to Bud's ear. Bud yelled and squirmed around. The witch doctor held on to the little thread till he felt the male earwig stop, waited till he found his mate, then pulled the thread out of there with all of his might. Bud shrieked in agony as the male earwig came catapulting out of his ear, holding the female earwig in his long, creepy legs. Bud was relieved, ready to go, ready to forget about the bugs and get on with his hunting, when suddenly he remembered the earwig had crawled into his left ear and was yanked out of his right. The witch doctor shrugged with a smile. That always happened with the females. They like to burrow right deep inside the head to lay their eggs in the brain. This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Oh, Bud survived, his hearing improved, and yes, if he stands sideways, you can see right through his head.
This is a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, Tuesday at 2. That's what I called her, because that's when she'd come in to see me for her wash and set. Now, Tuesday at 2 didn't have much of a life. Oh, I could tell by the way she dragged herself around and talked about her husband's ailments and medications, and unhappy people are not big tippers. So, one Tuesday, she was on her way here when she heard a tiny noise and noticed the cutest little kitten. Tuesday at 2 felt sorry for the little thing, so she scooped it up. The kitten snuggled up to her and started to purr, so Tuesday decided to keep it. She and her husband, they took this little kitty in and loved it to bits. I mean, who doesn't love a kitty? And this little fella was adorable. But he didn't have much of a tail, just this little Bob thing. So they decided to call him Bob. Bob changed Tuesday's life, I can tell you that. She came in here laughing with a real spring in her step. She even got me to put a little color in her hair. She chattered on and on about Bob and how cute he was and how he liked to sleep on her pillow and jump in the laundry basket when she was folding clothes. She told me that her grumpy old husband had fallen in love with the kitty too. I wish I could say they all lived happily ever after, but I'm telling you a fib. Here's what happened. Well, the kitty started exploring and managed to get himself stuck up in a big old tree where Mr. and Mrs. Tuesday couldn't reach him. They tried to tempt Bob with kitty treats, but the kitty just climbed higher and higher. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Tuesday at 2 weren't going to climb a tree. No, sir. They put a high value on their bones. Tuesday was just about to call 911 when her hubby said he had an idea and ran off to get some rope. I admit, it was a pretty good idea. They were going to try to lasso the end of the branch where the kitten was sleeping and pull it down towards the ground. That way, Bob would easily be within their reach. After a few tries, the lasso finally got around the branch. The old dears had to pull and pull on the rope with all of their might in order to make it move. Bit by bit, the branch came closer and closer to the ground. The plan was definitely going to work. But their strength ran out at the exact moment Bob was in reach. They both let go of that rope at the same time. That branch snapped back with all the force of nature behind it, and the cat was catapulted through the air. It soared way out of sight. And once more, Tuesday's life was changed, but this time for the worse. She stopped smiling. She even stopped getting her hair done. Now, this next part you're not going to believe, but you'd better because, like I said, it's true. Stay with me now. A few weeks later, when Tuesday at 2 was in the grocery store doing a little shopping, she found herself roaming up and down the cat food aisle thinking about the good times, and that's where she bumped into Doris, a friend of hers, who lived out in the country. Tuesday didn't see much of her since she moved from the neighborhood. Nothing spectacular, I admit, except that Doris was buying cat food, and as far as Tuesday knew, Doris didn't have a cat. "Doris," she said, "you don't have a cat." "I do now," Doris answered. And she proceeded to tell Tuesday at 2 the story of how she came to own a cat. One afternoon, she was in her garden doing a little pruning and snipping some roses when the most beautiful little kitten fell right from the sky into her basket. I call him Mr. Stubbs because he doesn't have much of a tail. It was such a shock to Tuesday at 2 that she staggered backwards and fell right into a big pyramid of cats, knocking the whole display over. Oh, she didn't die or anything. Not that she didn't want to. Mr. Stubbs and Bob were one and the same cat, and Tuesday knew it. It's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine. Tuesday at 2 will be here any minute. You can ask her yourself.